Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Teeth Matter. I'm your host, Ellie Halabian, DDS, and in this episode, we're chatting with Dr. Natanya Brown. Dr. Natanya is a specialist. She's a trained endodontist. She studied in Puerto Rico, then moved to Boston, and now lives in the Bay Area. And it's interesting because she went from associate to practice owner, and recently, just after COVID, decided to pull away from dentistry and focus on life coaching. So we're talking to her about her reasons for leaving dentistry, what did she find the most challenging when she was a practice owner, and so much more. Let's dive in. Hi there, Dr. Natanya Brown. Thank you so much for being on the Teeth Matter podcast.
I'm really excited to be here, Ellie. Thank you so much. And please call me Natanya.
I'm so excited to have you on. I want to know your story. Everyone wants to know your story. And it's a really interesting story because you go on to do your dental training, then you go on to specialize in endodontics, and then you go about from being an associate to a practice owner. And that all seems like the win, the jackpot. Like you're a practice owner, you're a successful dentist. But now we find you being a dental consultant or a life coach. And so what happened? At what point in your career did you realize that this isn't me and this is not what I want?
Yeah, well, you know what? You're asking an amazing question. I could probably spend 20 hours answering it. But a lot of people, it's interesting even how you ask it, because a lot of people actually assume that I left because like I couldn't stand dentistry, which
Mm.
isn't true at all. I loved clinical endodontics and certainly not all aspects of it, right? I mean, I would be lying if I said I enjoyed every aspect of patient management, staff management, and every single procedure. So like anything else, it has its pros and cons, but I did really enjoy the clinical aspect immensely.
Mm.
I did own a practice for a handful of years. And at that time, I was totally in over my head, didn't know what I was doing at all. And I felt like the best solution at the time, like I felt like I was out of solutions. I tried a lot of different things. And I thought that I needed to sell my practice for my mental sanity. And
Mm.
so practice ownership, at the time I felt like practice ownership was not for me. And so I was very happy to sell and go back to being an associate. But interestingly, it was after I sold and I went back to being an associate that I got introduced to coaching. And it was through a podcast, and then one thing led to another. And, I was like, oh, this coaching stuff is kind of interesting. So, as the self development or it all kind of piqued my curiosity. And as I was learning more and reading more books and listening to more podcasts, I decided to work with a coach. And ultimately, after working with several coaches, I was like, I'd love to become certified. Never really thinking like, oh, this is going to be my exit out of dentistry,
Mm.
And so, I'm happy to get into a lot more detail with all of it. But really, I didn't leave clinical practice because I couldn't stand it or I was so excited to create a second career. It's almost like it found me. And, I maintain an active license. It's possible that I'll go back to clinical dentistry at some point. But, certainly at this point, I have a thriving coaching practice that I'm excited to talk about, certainly.
That's amazing. And now, how long have you been out of practice?
So the last root canal I did was on my mom about 2 years ago. And I had already stopped practicing for probably at least a year prior to that.
Okay.
I only came back. I told my mom, I'm like, I'm only doing this because you're my mom.
VIP patient.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it's been a few years at this point. Yeah.
And we're definitely going to dive into, your career as a life coach, but I want to just go back a little bit. And you said it wasn't the clinical aspect that made you leave dentistry. It was more so the practice management and
Yeah.
being a practice owner. So I guess my question is, if you saw yourself not being able to handle the management of an office, did you ever consider bringing someone in to do that for you so that you could focus on the clinical?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, at the time, and now we're talking about like this was 8, 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago. I was aware of practice consultants and, people that would maybe come in and help like boost productivity and that kind of thing. I didn't know about anybody that would be able to help me in terms of managing a lot of the self-doubts that I had. For
Mm,
example, a lot of what I was dealing with was, feelings of inadequacy as a leader, not sure if I was, handling situations properly with my staff, um, comparing myself with the other more established endodontists in the area. And so a lot of it had to do with just internal, self doubts, imposter syndrome, and really trying to live up to a certain expectation of, how I was supposed to be, for example, or rules for what things should look like. So on paper, things were okay, right? Like I was married with 2 kids. I had an endodontic practice, theoretically or hypothetically, everything should have been great. And yet I also just, I'd be driving home from work and I would just be crying almost
mm,
every day, thinking about, everything that I may have done not properly in the office. And I'm not talking about procedures, just, how one manages things, for example, and then rushing to like pick up my kid from daycare. So it was also like compounded by mommy guilt of, not
mm,
really spending time with my kids, which at the time were very, very young.
mm,
But getting back to the heart of your question, did I ever consider working with somebody? To be honest, I don't think I was aware of the options. I felt
mm,
very alone and isolated. And my husband is a business guy. He had gotten his MBA during the same time that I went through my endodontic training. And I think most people just sort of assumed, like, oh, your husband is a business guy. He'll totally help you run the practice or whatever. And that, bless his soul, he's great. But he doesn't know how to hire a dental assistant or, run payroll in a dental practice. Those were all things that I just needed to learn how to do. And thankfully, over time, I did. But really getting back to the heart of your question, like I felt like it was one challenge after another. And I
mm,
didn't have the tools. I hadn't really acquired the tools to become an effective leader. And so I felt like selling was the only option. And interestingly, the tools that I've since learned through coaching, I look back and I ask myself, did I really need to have sold my practice? Is it possible that I could have really grown as a leader, become more confident in myself? All of the above. I think it's totally possible. And interestingly, I think what I know now is that at the time when I sold my practice, it was very much like a fire sale. Like I can't wait to get rid of this thing because
mm.
happiness is just on the other side of that sale. And
Right.
and here's the thing, I know so many dentists that feel the same way. Like they kind of can't wait to sell their office and go back to being an
Mm,
associate or retiring. And because I've been through the process, right? I sold my practice, I went back to being an associate. For sure, there were advantages to going back to being an associate. But the reality of the situation is that we can't allow our happiness to depend on, like the situation that we've created for ourselves. Some of it we can control for sure. Like, yes, we have control over whether we own a practice or whether, we're an associate. And yet,
mm,
there's going to be stressors no matter what. There isn't necessarily a perfect situation.
mm,
So, the tools that I learned through coaching really helped me to create that sense of internal balance and peace. And I guess probably a better way to describe it is like mental stability. I felt when I owned my practice that I was very much at the mercy of what was going on externally. Like if a
mm,
patient, didn't pay a bill, or if a staff member was out sick, or like God forbid if a patient left a bad Yelp review, then I was at the mercy of all of those things. And at the end of
right.
the day, I would come home and be totally stressed out and take it out on my husband. And, in my specific case, I would be like grabbing something yummy to eat to make myself feel better. And so Anyway, I digress.
No, it's
But
fine.
hopefully I can hopefully you're getting a sense of like,
Yeah,
the volatility that I felt at that time.
right. And I do, and I wanted to ask you is, do you think these were just like internalized pressures that you felt, or did you actually feel this from like your staff members and them not like enjoying your leadership style, or did you get any like backlash from them, or was this just more like, oh, your self-doubts that you were just projecting out there?
That's a really great question. I didn't get backlash from the staff. Well, I had a lot of turnover of staff, a lot of
Okay.
turnover. So I think I had a lot of thoughts of maybe I'm not a great leader because I can't retain
Mm,
my staff, or what am I doing wrong because these
right.
people are quitting? And there were a lot of factors that went into that, right? Um, but I do think that somewhere along the line, I had acquired a lot of ideas as far as what a practice should be. And for me, as
Mm,
an endodontist, what should things look like? And what does it mean to present myself professionally? And, specifically honing in on that, like what does it look like to be professional and to be recommending treatment and to have a schedule full of patients and then have one of my kids be sick,
mm,
right? So like
right.
there was like this conflict between, yes, I want to be professional and I don't want to cancel on patients, and at the same time I have this other role that's really important, that's mom. Right.
Right.
So those were things I did not learn in dental school. And
Mm.
so I felt totally in over my head.
Right. I mean, I don't think they teach you any of this in dental school. You don't learn anything about practice management or practice ownership or that like the slightest bit on marketing and how to retain patients. All of that aside, you actually said something really interesting before, which was you left practice ownership to go to associateship thinking that it was going to be a relief or like easier, but there was still struggle. And I was listening to a podcast recently where James Corden said, make your decisions based on reason, not expectation. So we expect that if we leave that environment, then you're just gonna have that release, or like you're gonna let go of that burden, right? That baggage. But you don't know what the outcome of that decision is gonna be because we don't know. It's unknown. But if you make the decision to leave practice ownership, you should do it for your own reasons so that when you do leave and you do experience that exit, however it turns out, you'll be satisfied with your decision.
Yeah.
Did you feel satisfied once you left?
So I was happy for a period of time, right? Like there was a sense of relief of like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I don't have this thing. And yet at the same time, I think it's a lot to expect of any single office that it's going to just be this miraculous cure all, like this
Mm,
perfect fit.
right.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
every office has its issues, right? It's like a family. It has its own dynamics. And so, I was trading one thing for another,
Mhm.
right? And
Right.
you know, there's really I don't have any real judgment on whatever somebody wants, right? Like it's just what's ultimately, if somebody wants to own a practice, they just need to like their reasons. Or if somebody wants to be an associate and to stay an associate or associate for a certain time and then own, whatever the case may be, you just have to like your reasons. And so one thing that I was able to really look back and realize was that when I sold my practice, I wasn't selling it, really in a clear-headed state. I was selling it out of a place of reactivity. Like my
Mm,
happiness depended on it. Like I literally could not wait. I was counting down the days. And, I can laugh about it now, right?
yeah.
But the best analogy that I that comes to my mind is like, let's say you're married and you want to get a divorce. It's like
Mm,
it doesn't have to be an urgent thing. Like when you notice that energy of urgency, it's because there's negative feelings there that you want relief from those negative feelings, right? And
right.
changing the circumstance, sure, it can be helpful to a certain extent, and yet those feelings are still available in that next chapter or the new
Mm,
set of circumstances that you change to, right? So like for example, if you're like desperate to get out of a marriage, and leaving it in this reactive state, like, what does that really leave you receptive towards in your next relationship? Like, are you doing the internal work to
Right.
find peace in the divorce before actually leaving? I know that's kind of a crazy analogy, but you know, so for me, now when I work with people, it's less about you have to stay in your practice and you
Mm.
have to be happy with it, and it's more like, let's just find peace where we're at. And once we find peace, we can totally choose to stay or to go, but with the highest part of our brain, where there is no urgency. It's not
Hmm.
like, oh my gosh, my happiness depends on it. It's really just, you know this is what I'd like to do now in this next chapter of my life, right? And it's much
Yeah.
calmer and much more grounded.
No, I love that. Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. And when you went back into associateship and then you're, taking on these coaching lessons and you're exploring this new world, what were your reasons for leaving clinical dentistry completely?
So at that point, I had started building my coaching practice, and
Hmm.
one thing led to another as far as just like it was starting to grow. And then actually, once COVID hit, it was really this natural,
Mm.
I suppose, interruption in my clinical practice. And so at that point, I was like, all right, I'm going to just do this full time. And so, one thing led to another, and it really panned out.
Can you like dive into like what kind of services you're providing currently?
Absolutely. So, my goal when I help people is the majority of people come to me, they feel like they've been running around ragged, whether they're an associate or they own a practice. They've been running around ragged and typically haven't really been taking care of themselves,
Mm.
haven't really been listening to their own intuition or their inner guidance as far as what they really want out of life. Often they are women with children, just like I was, who are struggling at the end of the day to, do all the things they need to do and find any kind of 5-10 minutes for themselves.
Mm.
A large part of it has to do with reducing overwhelm, because what happens when we're overwhelmed is it's hard to make decisions that really help us to get to where we're going. When we're clouded with overwhelm, so many things to do, we feel like we're getting tugged, in different directions, and we don't really have clarity on what's the one thing that I want to accomplish today. And
Right.
then the other part is I love to help dentists have fun in their lives. So, it's hard to have fun when you feel like you have a million responsibilities and you're not even creating, in a mode of being able to think about where you want to go in your life. But
Mm.
it's so important to bring enjoyment and happiness and fun into our lives. So this is what I get to do with every person that I work with. And at this point, I offer both one-on-one as well as group coaching.
Oh, that's amazing. Do you think that you said your clients are mainly women, right?
Mhm.
Do you think it's because women and men experience stress differently?
That's a really great question. I don't know that I've really thought about the answer to that enough to like give you a well thought out answer.
Okay.
But what I will say is culturally, I think men, and obviously these are huge generalizations, but I do
Right.
think that men have been taught to internalize to keep things in more and just be less expressive in terms of
Mm.
what their experience is of day-to-day life, right?
Right.
I think women tend to be more likely to share or build connections or find, even one person, if not a small group, to really be able to connect and relate with. Um, so if I think back to, my years as a practice owner, I felt super, super isolated. And what I will say is now, in recent years and a handful of years,
Mm.
there I have noticed a big increase in the number of groups online. Like just for example, Facebook groups that are
Right.
specialized in catering to, the needs of different types of dentists. There's some that are, men and women, and then there's several that are only women. And they seem to be very, very supportive. Just in terms of, really connecting on some of the stressors that, both men and women have. And maybe not all of the things are going to be exactly the same between men and women. But
Right.
sorry, coming back to what was your question again? Do I think?
If men and women, well, do men and women experience stress differently?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I don't know that I'd really be able to answer it exactly.
No.
Yeah.
It's you're right. There's like a lot of support groups out there. Social media has become a tool for everyone to find community, find reassurance. And I was actually looking at an article recently that was focused on women and like uh, their, I guess, fear of negotiating and fear of vocalizing themselves in the workplace. And so that's, I think my question stemmed from that article that I read recently, which was like women don't value their work and they fear negotiating because they think that it's going to have a negative consequence on them in the workplace.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I was like, oh, maybe the women feel a lot of pressure to
Yeah.
behave a certain way or to fit a certain image just because of the social constructs that we're born into or that we're molded into.
Yeah, I mean, I would say undeniably, not to say that men don't have self-confidence or issues or issues with self-doubt, but I do think on average, I hear more women talking about it. Let's put it that way, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then just in terms of, just the other piece in terms of, you know, at least, let's say heterosexual couples, married couples, if the man is working, or let's say a dentist who has a wife, male dentist with a wife. Sorry, I'm like tangling my words. But I mean, a lot of childcare tends to end up on mom's shoulders, right? And so then, maybe the man is not thinking as much about childcare or his involvement in terms of after work. So I do think there are a lot of things that are creating, potentially more pressure on women, and high achieving women. And so, how men and women might process stress differently, I'm not sure, but I definitely think for sure culturally there's kind of differences in terms of just also maybe what is even like socially acceptable for expression of how you're feeling, for example. I think that is changing now, but I know at least the way I was raised, it wasn't always socially acceptable for a man to be talking about his feelings, for example.
I was going to ask you, do you think the environment has changed where we can actually vocalize how we feel and express ourselves, both men and women, doesn't matter, but like that conversation around like mental health and self-help is progressing?
Absolutely. I'm probably also not a great one to answer this question because I'm surrounded by self-help coaches, therapists, constantly. So this is the topic of conversation all day, every day. So it's hard for me to say, like, is it becoming more normalized, right? And is it becoming more socially acceptable? What I will say is I strongly feel compelled to be part of a growing group of dentists that are really seeking to change the narrative and to make it more socially accessible and to make it socially acceptable and to make it more acceptable to talk about, how are you feeling after a long day of dentistry, and to talk about, hey, I'm not doing okay, this is what I'm struggling with, and or to talk about, hey, I have a coach or I have a therapist or I'm on certain medications, for example. I mean, obviously there's a spectrum. And my work, I should also just really quickly clarify that as a life coach, there is a difference. There's some overlap, but there is certainly a difference between coaching and therapy. And so I have told clients in the past, or potential clients, like, hey, you may really benefit from seeing a therapist, right? So
Mm.
not to say that I would delve into, being able to handle everything exclusively.
Yeah.
But really, getting to the heart of your question, I think it's so important that we normalize that people should be able to talk about their feelings, talk about when they're stressed out. And also, a big part of my work is helping people to create the life that they want
Mhm.
by first becoming totally present and engaged in the life that they have. And what
Mm.
I mean by that specifically is I actually just gave a presentation and like recorded a few podcasts on this. So I'm going to try to like condense it down as succinctly and hopefully coherently as I can. But, as high achieving healthcare professionals,
Mhm.
when it comes to our feelings, we have been taught that our feelings are pretty inconvenient. Like we should just sort of be like robots, just dentistry producing robots during the day. And, so if we're feeling stressed out, we're taught to just bottle it up. Like, tough patooties, you need to just slap on your happy face and get back in the operatory, right? Because there's like a crown prep on number 3 you need to go do and be
Right.
done with in 50 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So one of the biggest things we're taught is like just suck it up and the show must go on, right? And sure, maybe that's served however many generations for a certain period of time, and yet I think currently it's becoming abundantly more and more clear that that's a
Mhm.
model that's a setup for burnout,
Right.
failure to really recognize what we're feeling and acknowledge that we are humans. As basic as that sounds, right? Like we're not robots. And so we actually have to think about I mean, if let's say this is a machine, our body is a machine, okay, that means we need water and food and to go to the bathroom during the day. Like
Mm.
like that's our physical needs. We need to move our body, we need to sleep. Those things are important for our physical body. And then there's the mental and emotional part of things, right? And it's so so important. What I see happen all too often is that, w- you know, I, we're stressed out during the workday. We come home, and I know for myself, I would raid the pantry or the fridge looking for something yummy. How many countless times have I heard my colleagues say, I've had a crazy day at work. I need a drink. And
Mhm.
this is a very common thing. And I say it with love and not judgment. I'm not pointing fingers like you're an evil person if you have a beer after work. That's not what this is about. But it, even just those words like, oh, I need a drink, it sounds innocent enough. But actually, there's a lot of dentists that are alcoholics that have
Yeah.
substance abuse. Maybe it's not alcohol, maybe it's something else. But we have grown to be dependent on something to help us to feel better, whether it's food, alcohol, social media. I mean, I'm super, whatever the word is, like I'm speaking to myself, right? Like there's always social media or something you can scroll on to take you out of the present moment and to temporarily feel better. So where I'm going with all of this is like a large part of my work is helping people to really feel what they're actually feeling, be present in the moment in their bodies. Previously I would have thought that sounded very woo woo, very out there, very, very touchy feely. But the reality is that in dental school, we're taught how to think very well.
Mhm.
We're taught how to think critically. And yet, somewhere along the lines in all of our dental training and higher education and a million and one CEs, have we lost sight of like what it means to be human and actually
Mm.
how to feel? And so my strong belief is that in order to really create the lives that we want, we need to learn how to feel again.
How do you get someone to be present? Like that, how do you get someone to actively be present?
That's a great question. I mean, so attention is probably the number one thing. Paying attention, you know? So like the simplest example I can give you is right now we're
Yeah.
chatting. Now,
Yeah.
I don't know. You might be thinking about what you're going to eat for dinner or whatever. Maybe I'm secretly thinking about what I ate for dinner last night. But but we're engaged in a conversation, right? It might be
Right.
by virtual, right? But there's still some degree of semi eye contact, right? And just being present, having a
Mm.
moment. And so probably what I would recommend for somebody that's struggling, we all have hamsters upstairs that are like constantly on the go. I need to do this and this and this and this. That's
Mm.
fine. But one way to just slow things down is just like, this is going to sound super cheesy, but I'm going to say it, is
No,
like,
tell me.
it's like, be your own best friend. Like, if you were just engaging in a conversation with yourself and just ask
Mm.
yourself, like, hey, how you doing? Like if you were to text your best friend or just text somebody that you haven't chatted with in a while, hey, what's up? How you doing? Tell me about what's new. And so it's sort
Right.
of like just checking in with yourself. How am I doing right now? So this doesn't require, 30 minutes of meditation and sitting saying, some mantra, although that's great if if that's available and that's helpful, then fantastic. But, throughout the workday, right? Like
Right.
there are different stressors that might pile up. There might be certain thoughts floating around in the mind, like, oh, I'm so annoyed at my assistant. They came in
Mm.
late again, or this patient is a gagger. Ugh, that's so annoying, or, whatever. And so
Right.
taking a moment while you're doing something, you could literally be drilling on a tooth and just be asking yourself, what am I actually feeling and experiencing right now?
Mm.
And recognizing like, oh, these are the thoughts that I'm having. These are the feelings that I'm having. Oh, I see. And so it's just recognizing what is your truth in that moment without even having to change anything. So you ask me, how do you get to be more present? I mean, that's the first recommendation I have.
Are you a big proponent of journaling? Like I have someone gifted me the 5 minute journal, I think it's called. And so like I haven't started yet, but like you're supposed to write something that you're looking forward to during the day. And then at the end of the day, you recap and like 5 things you're grateful for or something. What would you recommend or what are your thoughts on that?
I love it. I think journaling is fantastic. I think there's, for sure there's different types of journaling or ways that it might be more or less effective for each individual person. What I do is really simple. The way I was taught was just get your thoughts out of you, put it on paper.
Mm.
I mean, I use a computer, but whatever. You get your thoughts out.
Right.
And what you do is then you can look at it and say, oh, these are the thoughts that are coming up for me. Which ones are helpful and which ones are not so helpful? And that's it. And the way I like to see it is it's kind of like, when you floss your teeth, you are
Hmm.
getting out all the junk that's in there. You don't,
Right.
once you see that, you don't want to not floss because you're like, I know that there's junk in there. So when I journal, and this is what I teach to my clients, it's not like it's a requirement, but it's like hey, you might want to do this because there's a lot of junk floating around in our brains, a
Mm.
lot of junk. And when we
Yeah.
get it out, we can just it's like, oh my gosh, my brain is cleaner now, right?
Mm. Right. I
So
find when
that's the
you
way I
journal, like
approach it.
yeah, I find when you journal, like you process the emotion and you also kind of like compartmentalize what you're going through. So then you're like, oh, it's not as scattered, it's not as messy, it's not as overwhelming. And you just feel you have like more control over the
Yeah,
experience. So
yeah.
that's been helping me out a lot. But you mentioned that you do this for your clients, and we talked about journaling and we talked about being present, like at work and taking a moment. These are things that somebody can do on their own. But when it comes to like your services, like you do individual coaching sessions and group coaching sessions, what can you expect in each of those categories?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, in terms of one on one, no part of it is really cookie cutter. So, when somebody, let's say, schedules a consultation with me, I just ask them, talk to me about what you're struggling with the most. And I
Mm.
really get to the heart of figuring out, is it, are you struggling with perfectionism? Is it self doubts? Is it imposter syndrome? Is it overwhelm? Maybe it's all of the above, right?
Mm.
Um, and so then when I develop the process, I'm teaching them tools right from the first session that then we start to implement and they can put into practice throughout, the coming weeks, for example. So it's really, tailored to the individual's needs and their goals. In terms of group coaching, at the moment, the group coaching program that I'm offering is specifically to dentists that are wanting to up-level their fitness and to lose weight. So I have done extensive coaching in the health and fitness realm. So right now I'm taking a cohort of people through that process, which is super fun and exciting. I will be offering group coaching for, to help to reduce overwhelm and burnout as well. Hopefully very soon. So stay tuned.
Oh, that's amazing. And we'll obviously provide all the links in the show notes. One thing that did come to mind that I know we've like talked about other things since, but we were talking about the environment, right? And right now, the dental climate, or let's say the dental environment, we've gone from boutique practices, mom and pop dental offices, to more DSOs. Do you think the environment is encouraging more burnout because we have all this venture capitalist investment in dentistry?
That's a great question. I will say that I never worked for a DSO. So it's hard for me to say, although I have an idea of what it would be like, but I don't think that every experience is necessarily the same. So it's hard for me to say.
Okay.
What I will say is that the environment is changing, like the lay of the land, so to speak,
Yeah.
like the field of dentistry. There are shifts that are happening, right? It's hard for me to really fully describe it, but for sure, there's more and more DSOs. At the same time, we are also seeing more and more dentists that are like getting out of network, right?
Hmm.
And so there is an interesting shift happening, all while I think there are more people that are recognizing that the traditional model of, working like crazy and delaying any kind of enjoyment in their life, that's not working either, right?
Right.
So, more people are becoming aware of the help that they can enlist, whether it's a
Hmm.
coach or a consultant or whatnot. And regardless, I think more people are wanting to enjoy their life and
Right.
recognizing that they don't want to be burnt out.
Right.
So I think, let's put it this way. I think that it's really important to
Hmm.
get really intentional about what do you want your career to look like? Like if you're early, for anybody that's listening and they're early on in their dental career, what do you really want it to look like? Because it's possible that just by winging it, you could
Hmm.
end up burnt out, right? So
Right.
I think it's very important to get intentional and um and get clear on what your goals are.
I completely agree. Intentionality, I think, is key. And it's a realization that I've come to recently that I got to take little steps towards what I want, not be overwhelmed with like the end goal, right? So we're working on that. Now, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, how can they find you on like social media or your coaching program? How can they get more information?
Yeah, so they can check out my website, which is drnatanya.com. That's just drnatanya.com. I am on Facebook and on Instagram. On Instagram, it's at dr.natanya, so dr.natanya. And then also, if anybody is interested in receiving, I have the Busy Dentist Guide to Self-Care. They can download that by going to drnatanya.com/self-care. So that will give them my top 6 tips on things that you can do right now without, paying any money to be able to get more balance and clarity in your life and decrease stress. And so that's just an easy way to do something that could be helpful for yourself.
I love that. Before we sign off, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to just highlight before we log off?
Probably Probably the last thing I'll add is just that, so many people feel trapped, and
Mm,
they feel like they only have the skills of being a dentist. And I'm by no means trying to say like everybody needs to go jump and get some other career at all, but for anybody listening that feels like they're trapped or like they only have the skills to be a dentist for the rest of their life, I just really want to offer that, you know, like your dental career doesn't have to just be this linear thing where you're an
mm,
associate and then you buy a practice and you keep it for 35 years and then you retire and then you die. It, there's so many possibilities within dentistry and then tons of possibilities outside of dentistry if you want to
right.
consider it, if that's at all relevant. And if not, that's fine too. Um, but just to like not feel limited by your dental degree. I think that's kind of what I would say is like there's truly so much that you can do, that one can do. And to you know recognize that the entire thing is just a journey, right?
Mm,
Like life isn't magically happier when you're a practice owner. It's not magically happier when you sell and you become an associate, right? Or whatever the case may be. It's really, and I know this is going to sound super cliche, but it really is all just about the journey.
right. I appreciate that. I actually have one last question for you. Do you still identify as a dentist?
That's a great question. Um, I would say yes, for sure. And I go to so many dental meetings and I speak at dental meetings. And so, yes, for sure, I will still say I'm an endodontist and a life coach. But that's a really great question because
Mm.
somewhere along the lines, one of the coaches that I worked with, they kind of asked me, like, why do you think you keep the doctor title? And for sure, I think there's some ego involved in there, right? Like
Right.
it just sort of
Yeah.
it feels good, right? But yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think where I'm at is a place where I usually do introduce myself as like an endodontist and a life coach, although in some circles I have started to say former endodontist, and that feels a little
No,
weird to
interesting.
me. That's kind of like a funny little transition as well. So I'm kind of watching myself go through that mental identity shift as well.
Do you think it feels weird because you don't want to close the door on it? Like, would you ever consider going back to practicing?
I might go back to practicing one day, although I
Mm,
don't have any plans of that at this
yeah.
point. Um, but yeah, I think for me personally, and I would imagine a lot of people identify with this, is that when you have spent so many years focused on becoming a dentist, it becomes a part, like we attach a part of a large part of our identity on it, right?
Right.
And then of course in my mind I could have thoughts like, well, but this is credibility, this gives me
Hmm.
credibility or whatever, right?
Right.
Which sure, maybe there's some truth to that. But it's just kind of interesting to just notice, we are all just people doing the best we can, and maybe we have a degree or maybe we don't have a degree, right?
Yeah.
So I say that just because it's kind of interesting, the things that we can kind of latch onto as far as our identity, and then um, allowing ourselves the freedom to experiment, like what if I wasn't attached to that identity, right? What would that
Right.
look like for me? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard concept to comprehend just because you invest so much time, like you said, training and getting your license, and it's an
Yeah.
accomplishment. Like it's not a degree that everyone holds in society, and so, like you said, there's some ego around it. But
Yeah.
absolutely, your career should not define you. I think we are multidimensional, right? As
Yeah.
individuals, we have different interests, different hobbies, and so we should, as we grow, we should become more comfortable accepting the fact that we do like different things and we don't have,
Yeah.
like just the one thing. So
Yes.
that's, yeah,
Yeah.
that's my realization too.
100%. And what came up for me just as you said that is I know some people, for example, that I'm working with, or even those that I'm not, that might feel a little bit concerned with like how do they attract patients, and how do they kind of form their own identity as a dentist with a great following of patients. And they don't care about your degree. I mean, maybe some patients do, but the vast
Mm.
majority are going to be like, okay, yes, you've got your license. I don't care what grades you
Right.
got. They care about your personality. They care about, like, you know, uh, the things that you might mention in a conversation that make you actually three-dimensional, not just a piece of
Right.
paper on the wall, right?
Yeah. That's absolutely true. Somebody once told me that it doesn't matter if you're first in your class or last in your class, the last person in class is also called doctor.
Yep.
So in terms of like being competitive at school and trying to get the best grades or like trying to get, I don't know, like a distinction, it really doesn't mean much
Yep.
ultimately because when you come out of school, you're providing a service, but the service, it depends on the patient relationship, like the human connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that is so important. So, so, so important. And especially, I mean, obviously, this isn't the conversation for like business and marketing and, having more patients say yes to your treatment. But like a large part of, case acceptance is really getting the patient to a point where they really emotionally want that
Hmm.
treatment.
Yeah.
It's not just on paper, right? Like a robot can do an exam and can tell them what they need, right? We're getting to a point where AI will probably do exams at some point, right? Like, or
Yeah.
look at the x-rays, right?
Right.
But
Exactly.
actually the emotions are really that is what makes us human. And that
Yeah.
is what patients want. They want a human dentist. They don't want a
Mm.
robot dentist, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's true. And case acceptance is like a whole different topic on its
Yes,
own. But
that is a whole separate topic.
but Dr. Natanya, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I appreciate your time and your wisdom. I'll share everything with the listeners. And yeah, thanks again.
So fun. Thank you so much. This has been a real treat.